After a long sleepless night on Peleliu, the dawn of a new day, September 16, 1944, finds the Marines of the 1st Marine Division, holding only a slim beachhead, far less in size than initially planned. Therefore, expanding and securing the beachhead, large enough for the undisturbed delivery of supplies, became a top priority of the day. Furthermore, besides Japanese defenders, another significant factor troubling the Marines on the island was the intense heat and high temperature, which caused dehydration, and water, besides ammunition, had become in high demand. Unfortunately for the Marines, the barrels used to deliver it had previously been used to store aviation fuel without being appropriately cleaned, causing many of the much-needed Marines temporarily incapacitated. On the morning of the same day, at 9:50 a.m., with all of his division units already ashore, General William Rupertus, the 1st Marine Division commander, landed with his staff and took charge of the operation, setting his command post in an anti-tank ditch, just inland of Orange Beach 3. At that time, he could still count on the 2 regiments of the 81st Infantry Division, assigned as the 3rd Amphibious Corps Reserve, stationed on transport ships next to Peleliu. His main concern was the division's left flank, where the situation was most critical. After having suffered the heaviest losses on D-Day, Puller's 1st Marines still faced serious problems. Following heavy preparatory artillery barrage and airstrikes, at 8 a.m., along the entire beachhead, the Marines resumed the attack, and the 1st Marines moved forward according to schedule. On the right flank of the regimental sector, the 2nd Battalion, tying firmly with the 5th Marines on their right, made excellent progress during the second day, advancing north across the western end of the airfield, reaching the built-up area between the airstrip and the mountains, within half an hour. Many of the structures there have been made of reinforced concrete, now blasted to rubble by the heavy naval gunfire, providing excellent cover for the defending Japanese infantry, which resulted in this area becoming the scene of some brutal, close-quarters fighting. Unlike the 2nd, the 3rd Battalion, on the critical left flank of the division's zone, was unable to advance at all, still facing stiff and well-organized Japanese resistance from the positions on the rugged terrain in front of them, which would prove to be the first line of the main Japanese defense in depth, centered around Umurbrogol Mountains. To assist the 3rd Battalion in achieving the breakthrough, in the afternoon, Puller committed his reserve, the 1st Battalion, while at the same time, General Rupertus ordered the division's reserve, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines, to reinforce the 1st Marines, in an effort to maintain momentum, as Rupertus liked to say, to his officers. Slowly but steadily, the 1st and 3rd Battalion, supported by tanks, began systematically reducing the complex and puzzled defense systems in their zone of operation, advancing by evening some 500 meters inland, establishing contact with elements of Company K, that had been isolated behind enemy lines for some 30 hours. Throughout the night, the 1st Marines successfully repelled several fierce Japanese counterattacks. Meanwhile, the 2 remaining divisions' regiments also pushed forward. The 5th Marines in the center moved on to complete their main objective of taking the airfield, and the 7th Marines on the right flank advanced to secure the east coast and the southern end of the island. The 5th Marines' day began badly, after an artillery shell hit the regimental command post, inflicting additional casualties on the already crippled headquarters unit, and injuring their commanding officer, Colonel Harris. Considering the losses suffered by the headquarters unit on D-Day, this blow seriously affected the regimental command situation for the rest of the battle. This misfortune, however, did not prevent the 5th Marines from launching their attack on time. And while they had some protection by the woods along the beach during D-Day, this time, the Marines had to advance across the area, stripped of any cover, and with no place to hide. The 1st and the 2nd Battalion moved carefully, followed by constant Japanese artillery and mortar fire, accurately directed from observation posts on the higher ground, set on the nearby Umurbrogol Mountains, making their progress slow and grueling. On the left flank of the regimental zone, the 1st Battalion's advance was somewhat faster. In a little over an hour, the Marines swept the entire northern end of the airfield, with only serious resistance encountered in front of a series of emplacements around the hangar area, which the Marines secured in the late afternoon, after heavy fighting. The 2nd Battalion, in the meantime, faced heavier Japanese resistance while advancing along the eastern side of the airfield, where woods gave way to a mangrove swamp. Both the woods and swamp were full of Japanese emplacements, which had to be reduced by hand-to-hand combat. The fight took all day and inflicted heavier casualties on Battalion than they had suffered on D-Day. Because of the advances of the 2nd Battalion on its left and the 7th Marines on its right, the 3rd Battalion was effectively cut off from operations during the day, limiting its efforts to securing its positions along the coast, and assisting the remainder of the 5th Marines as needed. On the southern end of the beachhead, the 7th Marines resumed the attack to secure its designated sector. After destroying the Japanese strongpoint at the reinforced concrete blockhouse, which had been holding them back since the previous day, the 3rd Battalion reached the eastern coast at approximately 9:25 am, where they dug in, preparing for the night, and another day of battle. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion attacked southwards, over a scrub overgrowth that slowed their progress. As they advanced, they neutralized the Japanese defense party on the small unnamed island, which lay just north of Orange 3 Beach, and from where the Marines had been harassed by small arms fire the entire previous day and night. The neutralization of this strong point allowed the battalion to proceed towards their primary objective, the southwestern promontory, commonly known as Ngamote Island. On their way, the Marines came across strong Japanese positions, densely packed with bunkers, pillboxes and rifle pits, all part of the beach defenses, prepared against the possible landing in this area. However, fortunately for the Marines, these extensive and well-prepared positions also faced seaward, allowing them to assault them from their less protected flanks and rear. Anyhow, after a fierce fight, around 10:25 am, the Marines reached the southern end of Peleliu, where they halted and stayed overnight, preparing for the following day's assault on the southwestern promontory. Again, as the previous day, the progress was painfully slow, casualties were high, and with the first dark, the Marines dug in for the night, and waited for the Japanese act of self-destruction that never came. The lack of frenzy banzai charge, for the second night in a row, was the first indication that something different was in store for attacking Marines on Peleliu. They could not even imagine what nasty surprises this small island in the western Pacific hides. Yet, despite the slow progress, on September 16, General Rupertus was convinced that Peleliu would be secured in a few more days, and based on his assessment, the 3rd Amphibious Corps commander, General Roy Geiger, released the 81st Division from the reserve, ordering them to proceed with the assault on Ongawa. The painfully slow and deadly progress would continue over the next few days, and it would soon become the main characteristic of this battle. From the moment they landed, Marines encountered numerous casemates, blockhouses, bunkers and pillboxes, scattered all over the island, many of which were still intact, or only slightly damaged by pre-invasion naval gunfire, manned by the brave Japanese soldiers, well trained and armed, determined to make the Marines pay dearly for every inch of Peleliu. The large number of soldiers, concentrated in a small area, ultimately led to a battle fought at an extremely close range, which usually ended up in hand-to-hand combat. In this kind of environment, surrender was not an option. Close-quarter combat caused extensive use of flamethrowers and hand grenades, best illustrated by the fact that out of 8 Marines who received the Medal of Honor for their bravery during the Battle of Peleliu, 6 of them were awarded for throwing themselves on hand grenades, absorbing the blast with their bodies, to protect their fellow Marines. Miraculously, only First Lieutenant Carlton Rue survived such an act. There have been, most certainly, heroic acts on the Japanese side as well, but only a small number of them survived to tell about it. Battle fatigue was common in this vicious and brutal fight. Even battle-hardened veterans, which already survived previous campaigns on Guadalcanal and New Britain, considered the Battle of Peleliu as the toughest fight of the entire war. As one 1st Marine Regiment veteran recalled, "I didn't worry about death anymore. I had resigned from the human race. I crawled and scrambled forward, and lay still without any feeling towards any human thing. In the next foxhole was a rifleman. He peered at me through red and painful eyes. I didn't care about him, and he didn't care about me. As a fighting unit, the 1st Marines were finished. We were no longer human beings. I fired at anything in front of me, friend or foe. I had no friends. I just wanted to kill." And indeed, by September 17, the 1st Marines were on the verge of ceasing to exist as a fighting unit, after suffering over 1,000 casualties in 2 days. Undoubtedly, the Japanese also lost many of their troops, some during the pre-invasion bombardment, and certainly, plenty of them in 2 days of battle. However, their resistance showed no signs of weakening. On the contrary, it became more ferocious as the Marines pushed more inland. On the same day, the lead elements of the 1st Marines came into contact for the first time with Umurbrogol Mountains, which proved to be the major terrain feature of the island. Stripped away of vegetation by the naval gunfire, an intimidating ridge system stood revealed before the terrified Marines, about to attack it. The 1st Marines regimental narrative gives the best description of what the Marines encountered, portraying the terrain as, "The ground of Peleliu's western peninsula was the worst ever encountered by the regiment, in 3 Pacific campaigns. Along its center, the rocky spine was heaved up in a contorted mass of decayed coral, strewn with rubble, crags, ridges and gulches, thrown together in a confusing maze. There were no roads, scarcely any trails. The pockmarked surface offered no secure footing even in the few level places. It was impossible to dig in. The best the men could do was pile a little coral or wood debris around their positions. The jagged rock slashed their shoes and clothes and tore their bodies every time they hit the deck for safety. Casualties were higher for the simple reason it was impossible to get under the ground, away from the Japanese mortar barrages. Each blast hurled chunks of coral in all directions, multiplying many times the fragmentation effect of every shell. The 1st Marines began their day's advance with all 3 battalions in line. The 3rd Battalion was on the left flank. The 1st took the position in the center, while the 2nd Battalion moved on the right, maintaining contact with the 5th Marines. They made good progress at first, until the 2nd Battalion came under heavy fire from Hill 200, the first of many Umurbrogol ridges. The hill dominated the entire airfield area, and from observation posts set there, the Japanese directed the artillery fire along the beachhead line. Straight away, the Marines began to scale the steep slopes, facing deadly small arms fire at point-blank range. At such a close distance, the Japanese fire was extraordinarily accurate, and casualties among the assault troops mounted. However, after bitter hand-to-hand fighting, by nightfall, the Marines secured the chest of Hill 200, and immediately came under fire from the next, slightly higher ridge, the one called Hill 210. This pattern would repeat itself, and every time the Marines secured one strong point, they would come under fire from another, in this interconnected, and mutually protected, defense in depth. Not long after the 2nd, the 1st Battalion in the center, also came across the main Japanese line, but only after they overcame the strongpoint, centered around a large concrete blockhouse, surrounded by a dozen pillboxes connected by tunnels. By afternoon, the 1st Battalion had seized Hill 150, Hill 160, and part of Hill 180, suffering 250 casualties. The severity of the fighting was best described by the report sent by one company commander to headquarters, who stated, "We're up here, but we're knee-deep in Purple Hearts. Only the 3rd Battalion, moving along a relatively flat coastal plain, was able to make progress. However, problems encountered by the rest of the 1st Marines also grounded their advance to a halt. On the same day, September 17, the 7th Marines moved on, determined to complete their task of securing the island's southern part. The 3rd Battalion moved out to take the southeast promontory. Their attack, however, had to be postponed from 8 am to 10 am, after engineers, working further ahead, discovered a minefield laid down across the sand spit. Once they crossed the spit, supported by 3 medium tanks, they encountered only scattered resistance, and by 1:20 p.m., the Marines secured the entire area. For the rest of the day, the 3rd Battalion mopped up the isolated Japanese defenders, hidden in their underground installations, which turned out to be a difficult and stressful task. For his actions during the fight for the southeastern promontory, Private First Class Arthur J. Jackson was awarded Medal of Honor, after single-handedly annihilating the entire Japanese pocket of resistance, concealed in strongly fortified positions, consisting of a large bunker and several pillboxes, armed only with an automatic rifle and hand grenades, killing at least 35 Japanese soldiers. The attack on the much larger, and more rugged southwestern promontory, began at 8:35 am, when the 1st Battalion launched their assault, meeting fierce resistance from the very beginning. At the narrow bottleneck, right in front of the sand spit, the Marine assault immediately stalled, and was not resumed until 2:30 p.m., when all available tanks and armored Amtraks arrived, to reinforce assault troops. Supported by armor, the Marines successfully advanced across the spit, taking a narrow foothold on the other side. The Japanese put up stiff resistance, reducing the Marines' progress to a crawl, on the terrain limited for maneuver. By nightfall, the Marines were barely in control of only half of the promontory. Throughout the night, additional armor was brought in, and at 10 am on September 18, the 1st Battalion resumed the attack. Again, as on the previous day, the progress was slow, and resistance was strong. With the front line not being clearly defined, many reserve elements operating behind the first line frequently came under attack by the Japanese troops from bypassed caves and underground emplacements. A fierce and confusing battle raged until 1:44 p.m., when battalion companies reached the southern coast. With the seizure of 2 promontories, the 7th Marines secured the southern end of the island, and at 3:20 p.m., Colonel Hannigan reported to General Rupertus, "The 7th Marines' mission on Peleliu completed." Unfortunately, this was not quite the case. September 17 finds the 5th Marines somehow split between the 1st Battalion on the left, which had stuck in front of Umurbrogol Mountains, and the 2nd Battalion, which had made some progress, advancing through the jungle and mangrove swamp north of the airfield, alongside the road leading toward the eastern peninsula. The thick, and nearly impenetrable scrub on their path, reduced the 2nd Battalion's progress to a crawl, and at the same time, concealed most of the advancing Marines from the Japanese observations, on high ground to their left. Resistance along the way was light, allowing the battalion to advance beyond its objective line. However, regardless of negligible resistance, extreme heat and rough terrain began to take their toll, forcing the Marines to stop frequently for the rest, further reducing their day's advance. The following day, on September 18, the 2nd Battalion resumed their advance again, moving through dense vegetation mixed with swamps, narrowing their path to a single road, once more, against almost no resistance, suffering more casualties from friendly fire than from the Japanese. To exploit their gains, Colonel Harris shifted its 3rd Battalion to assist the 2nd, in clearing the eastern peninsula. For the next 3 days, the 5th Marines advanced steadily, fighting only scattered Japanese stragglers, who seemed more interested in hiding than fighting. By September 21, after securing Jabad Island, which they found unoccupied, the 5th Marines had cleared the entire eastern peninsula. Meanwhile, In front of Umurbrogol Mountains, soon named Bloody Nose Ridge by the Marines, more than half of the 1st Marine Division was engaged in head-on frontal attacks against a formidable defensive system on the harsh terrain. Puller's 1st Marines, who were in the epicenter of this desperate struggle, by September 18, had already suffered 1,236 casualties. And yet, Puller was still urged on, by General Rupertus, to maintain momentum. After 4 days of heavy combat, the battle was not even remotely over. In fact, it became apparent that the conquest of Peleliu wasn't to be as brief as originally planned. Actually, the battle for Peleliu has just begun.